Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. The person who talks the most in the room is not the most powerful, they are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks only once, and that single truth alone is enough to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built until today. 95% of people negotiate in a way that makes the other party win automatically, not because they are weak, but because they do not realize they started losing before they ever opened their mouths. And what is more dangerous than the loss itself is the false sense of security that accompanies it. If you need other people's approval to validate your decisions, you have not built an identity yet, you have built a dependency. The person you think is confident in your circle most likely does not possess confidence at all. They possess trained indifference, engineered with precision and deliberate practice. The difference between the two does not reveal itself in ordinary moments. It reveals itself the instant pressure is applied, and everything collapses within seconds. There is one sentence, if spoken at the beginning of any negotiation, that makes the other party feel they are in control while you are the one orchestrating everything from behind an invisible curtain. This sentence is not magic, it's linguistic engineering built on a deep understanding of how the brain functions under the pressure of decision. And the book you are about to hear today is not taught in MBA programs for one reason only, because it explains how the game works from the inside in a language never designed for the general public. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. This is for those who have made a final, irreversible decision to understand how social dominance is built scientifically and systematically, far beyond empty slogans and packaged advice. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction whatsoever, close this video. But if you feel there is another level you have not yet reached, a level seen by few and lived by even fewer, continue, because what follows was engineered for you alone. Every single day you pass without understanding these rules, someone else is understanding them and applying them to you in complete silence. This is not a theoretical assumption, and it is not rhetorical exaggeration. This is what is happening right now in every boardroom, at every negotiation table, and in every relationship where one party believes the dynamic is equal. The money you did not earn this month did not vanish into thin air. It went to someone who knows one rule you do not know yet, and it will keep going to them for as long as this cognitive gap remains open. You are about to be confronted with a fact that will feel deeply uncomfortable, not because it is complex, but because it directly challenges the narrative your brain has been constructing and reinforcing for years. The world, by almost every measurable metric that matters, is getting better. Not marginally better, not better in isolated pockets visible only to the privileged, better in ways that span continents, cross income levels, and penetrate communities that the dominant media narrative has permanently assigned to the category of hopeless. Child mortality has plummeted, extreme poverty has collapsed, literacy has surged. Life expectancy has climbed across regions that were written off as permanently disadvantaged a single generation ago. And yet, when researchers, journalists, executives, and world leaders are asked basic questions about global trends, they perform worse than random chance. They perform worse than a chimpanzee selecting answers blindly. This is not an insult. This is a clinical data point that demands explanation. Hans Rosling spent decades collecting this data. He stood in front of the most educated audiences on the planet, Davos delegates, Nobel laureates, senior government officials, and watched them fail basic tests of factual knowledge about the world they claimed to understand and lead. The pattern was not random. The errors were not distributed evenly across topics. The mistakes clustered around a specific type of question, questions about whether things were improving or deteriorating, whether gaps were widening or narrowing, whether the future was accelerating toward catastrophe or quietly stabilizing. And in every single case, the educated, informed, experienced human being chose the darker answer, not occasionally, systematically. This systematic darkness is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of the human cognitive architecture, a set of deeply embedded instincts that were extraordinarily useful on the African savanna 200,000 years ago and are catastrophically misleading in a data-rich, globally interconnected, rapidly evolving 21st century environment. The brain was not built to process statistical trends. It was built to detect threats, respond to drama, remember danger, and categorize the world into simple, opposing camps. These are the same instincts that kept your ancestors alive when a predator moved in the grass. They are the same instincts that are destroying your capacity to make accurate decisions about markets, people, investments, and strategies today. Factfulness is the antidote, not as a philosophical posture and not as optimistic wishing thinking, but as a rigorous, data-driven discipline that requires the same intellectual rigor as any advanced analytical framework. Factfulness is defined as the stress-reducing habit of only carrying opinions for which you have strong supporting facts. This definition is deceptively simple. Beneath it lies a complete restructuring of how you engage with information, how you evaluate claims, how you evaluate, assess risk, and how you construct the mental models upon which every significant decision in your professional and personal life depends. The implications for anyone operating at a high level in business, negotiation, or strategic planning are immediate and severe. If your map of the world is wrong, and the data suggests it almost certainly is, then every strategy you build on that map is compromised at the foundation. You are not making decisions about the real world. You are making decisions about a darker, simpler, more dramatic version of reality that exists primarily inside your own skull, assembled from media fragments, confirmation-biased social circles, and evolutionary instincts that have not been updated in 200 millennia. The 10 instincts Rosling identifies are not character flaws. They are not signs of intellectual weakness. They are universal features of human cognition that operate below the level of conscious awareness and distort perception before rational analysis even begins. Understanding them is not optional for anyone who claims to operate with strategic clarity. It is the prerequisite for everything else. Every significant strategic error you have ever made in business, in negotiation, in your assessment of markets, in your reading of people, can be traced back with surgical precision to a single cognitive failure: the compulsive human need to divide the world into two opposing camps and then assign everything you encounter to one side or the other. This is not a metaphor. This is not rhetorical flourish. This is the gap instinct, the first and most foundational of the 10 cognitive distortions that Rosling identified after decades of empirical research, and it is operating inside your decision-making architecture right now, at this very moment, regardless of your education level, your professional experience, or your self-assessed capacity for nuanced thinking. The gap instinct functions as a perceptual sorting mechanism that the brain deploys automatically and instantaneously whenever it encounters complexity. Rather than processing the full spectrum of a situation with all its gradations, contradictions, and contextual variables, the brain collapses that spectrum into two clean categories: developed and developing, rich and poor, us and them, winning and losing, safe and dangerous. The psychological relief this binary sorting provides is immediate and powerful. Complexity is metabolically expensive. The brain is an efficiency machine. Binary categorization is fast, low cost, and emotionally satisfying in a way that nuanced probabilistic thinking simply cannot replicate at the speed of real-world decision-making. The problem is not that binary thinking exists. The problem is that it is applied to a world that is fundamentally, irreducibly non-binary. Rosling's most devastating empirical contribution was demonstrating that the famous divide between the developed world and the developing world, the foundational geopolitical and economic binary that has structured international policy, business strategy, and popular consciousness for the better part of a century, is a statistical fiction. It does not exist in the data. What exists instead is a vast, densely populated middle ground that contains the overwhelming majority of the world's population, living lives that are neither the extreme poverty of the bottom nor the extreme affluence of the top, but something complex, improving, and categorically different from both poles. When executives make investment decisions based on the developing binary, they are making decisions about a map that does not correspond to the actual territory. When negotiators assess their counterparts through the lens of binary power dynamics, dominant or submissive, winning or losing, strong or weak, they are misreading the actual behavioral landscape in ways that systematically produce suboptimal outcomes. When strategists build market entry models based on the assumption that a population is either a viable consumer market or it is not, they are leaving an enormous and growing middle segment completely invisible in their analysis. For anyone operating in business or investment, this is not an academic observation. It is an operational recalibration of where value is being created and where it will continue to be created at accelerating rates. The companies, investors, and strategists who updated their mental models to reflect the four-level reality rather than the two-camp fiction have consistently identified opportunities that their binary thinking competitors missed entirely, not because they had better information, but because they had a more accurate cognitive framework for processing the same information. The antidote Rosling prescribes for the gap instinct is both simple and demanding in equal measure. When you notice yourself thinking in terms of two groups with a gap between them, your first obligation is to look for the majority. Where is most of the data actually located? Is it at the extremes confirming your binary, or is it in the middle, dissolving it? The second obligation is to question your comparison baseline. Gaps that look dramatic in absolute terms often disappear or reverse when examined in relative terms, and vice versa. The third obligation is the most cognitively expensive. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of a non-binary reality long enough for your analytical faculties to operate on it before your sorting instinct collapses it back into false simplicity. In the context of high-stakes negotiation and executive decision-making, the gap instinct manifests most dangerously as the tendency to categorize counterparts, competitors, and markets as either threats or opportunities, either allies or adversaries, either strong or weak. This binary misreads the actual behavioral spectrum of any sophisticated actor, which always contains elements of both categories simultaneously in proportions that shift dynamically with context. The negotiator who can hold the complexity of a counterpart who is simultaneously vulnerable and aggressive, cooperative and competitive, rational and emotionally driven, that negotiator operates in a strategic dimension that is simply inaccessible to the binary thinker sitting across the table. The world is not divided into two camps. It never was. And every decision you make that rests on that division is built on a foundation that the data has already demolished. There is a question that will deeply unsettle you if you allow yourself to sit with it honestly. If the world is genuinely improving across almost every measurable dimension, if child mortality is falling, if extreme poverty is retreating, if literacy is climbing, if life expectancy is extending across populations that were written off as permanently disadvantaged, then why does every serious, informed, educated person you know believe with absolute certainty that things are getting worse? Why does the feeling of global deterioration feel so self-evidently true that questioning it seems almost intellectually irresponsible? The answer is not ignorance. The answer is not laziness. The answer is the negativity instinct, a hardwired cognitive bias so deeply embedded in human neural architecture that it operates with the same automatic authority as breathing, and with consequences for your decision-making that are every bit as severe as the gap instinct that preceded it. The negativity instinct is the brain's systematic tendency to register, prioritize, process, and remember negative information with significantly greater intensity than positive information of equivalent magnitude. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that ruthlessly selected for organisms that paid more attention to threats than to opportunities, because the cost of missing a threat was death, while the cost of missing an opportunity was merely a suboptimal outcome. The organism that heard a sound in the darkness and immediately assumed predator survived more reliably than the organism that weighed probabilities. Over deep evolutionary time, this negativity bias became one of the most robustly established features of human cognition, and it remains fully operational in a 21st century environment where the threats it was designed to detect have been largely replaced by statistical trends, market dynamics, and geopolitical complexities that it is completely unequipped to evaluate accurately. Rosling's data on this point is both precise and devastating. When he presented audiences with factual questions about global trends, child mortality rates, access to electricity, girls in school, vaccination coverage, the overwhelming pattern of responses was not merely wrong, it was wrong in a specific, predictable direction. People consistently underestimated improvement, they consistently overestimated deterioration, and the gap between their estimates and the actual data was not marginal, it was enormous. In many cases, the reality was 2, 3, or 4 times better than the educated guess of an informed professional. This is not a random error distribution. This is a systematic bias operating with mechanical reliability across cultures, education levels, professional backgrounds, and political orientations. The media ecosystem within which modern professionals operate is not a neutral information delivery system. It is a highly optimized attention extraction machine, and the negativity instinct is its primary fuel source. Negative events are newsworthy in a way that positive trends structurally cannot be. A plane crash is a discrete, dramatic, emotionally resonant event that happens on a specific day and can be covered with images, narratives, and emotional intensity. The 10 million safe flights that occurred in the same year are not an event. They are a trend, and trends do not generate the neurological response that drives engagement, sharing, and return viewership. The result is a media environment that is not lying, it is reporting real events, but that is presenting a systematically distorted sample of reality that feeds and amplifies the negativity instinct rather than correcting it. For the executive, the investor, the strategist, and the negotiator, this has direct and measurable operational consequences. Risk assessment conducted under the influence of the negativity instinct systematically overweights downside scenarios and underweights upside trajectories. Market analysis filtered through negativity bias consistently underestimates the resilience and adaptability of economic systems. Competitive intelligence gathered by minds primed for threat detection will find threats everywhere, including in developments that a more calibrated analysis would identify as neutral or positive. Every strategic planning process that begins with a SWOT analysis and spends the majority of its intellectual energy on threats, weaknesses is, at the structural level, an institutionalized expression of the negativity instinct operating unchecked within a professional framework. Rosling's antidote operates on 3 levels simultaneously. The first is the discipline of distinguishing between bad and getting better, a distinction that the negativity instinct actively resists because it requires holding 2 apparently contradictory assessments in mind at the same time. Something can be genuinely bad by any reasonable standard and simultaneously be measurably, demonstrably improving. These 2 facts do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and the failure to hold both simultaneously produces strategic errors in both directions, either denying the problem because improvement exists or denying the improvement because the problem persists. The second level of the antidote is the deliberate cultivation of what Rosling calls the knowledge of improvement, a practice of actively seeking data on positive trends with the same systematic effort that the brain naturally devotes to registering negative developments. This is not optimism. It is not positive thinking in the motivational sense. It is a deliberate cognitive correction mechanism designed to counterbalance a known systematic bias in information processing. The professional who builds this practice into their analytical workflow is not seeing the world through rose-colored lenses. They are seeing it through calibrated lenses that account for the distortion introduced by uncorrected negativity bias. The third level is perhaps the most strategically significant for anyone operating in high-stakes environments. It is the recognition that the people you are negotiating with, competing against, and building with are all operating under the same negativity instinct, with the same systematic distortions. This means that in any environment where accurate assessment of reality confers competitive advantage, which is to say, in every serious professional environment, the person who has done the work of calibrating their negativity bias holds a structural informational advantage over every counterpart who has not. They are, quite literally, seeing a more accurate version of the same world. The news is not the world. The world is the data. And the data says something profoundly different from what your instincts are telling you to believe. There is a cognitive trap so elegant in its simplicity and so catastrophic in its consequences that it has brought down investment portfolios, collapsed market entry strategies, invalidated demographic projections, and produced policy disasters on a scale that reshapes entire national economies. It does not require ignorance to fall into. It does not require laziness or intellectual carelessness. It requires only the most natural, automatic, and seductive assumption the human mind makes. Confronted with a trend moving in a consistent direction, the assumption that it will continue moving in that same direction, at that same rate, indefinitely. This is the straight line instinct, and it is operating inside every forecast you have ever made, every projection you have ever trusted, and every strategic plan you have ever built on the foundation of a trend line extended into the future. The straight line instinct emerges from the same evolutionary architecture that produced the gap and negativity instincts. In the environment of evolutionary adaptation, most of the phenomena that mattered for survival did behave in approximately linear ways over the time horizons that were relevant to immediate decision-making. A predator moving toward you at a consistent speed would continue moving at that speed. A food source depleting at a consistent rate would continue depleting. The brain that could extrapolate a straight line from observed data points and act on that extrapolation had a genuine survival advantage. The problem is that the complex systems that dominate the modern strategic environment, population dynamics, economic growth curves, technological adoption rates, disease transmission patterns, market penetration trajectories, almost never behave linearly over the time horizons that matter for strategic planning. They follow S-curves, bell curves, exponential curves, and patterns of acceleration and deceleration that the straight line assumption makes completely invisible. Rosling's most powerful illustration of this instinct involves global population projections, one of the most consequential empirical questions in modern strategic planning. The dominant narrative, absorbed so thoroughly that it feels like settled science to most educated professionals, is that global population is growing relentlessly and will continue growing indefinitely, driving resource scarcity, environmental pressure, and geopolitical instability at accelerating rates. This narrative is built entirely on the straight line assumption, the extrapolation of historical population growth rates forward without any mechanism for detecting the inflection points where the curve changes shape. The actual demographic data tells a fundamentally different story. As countries move up income levels, as child mortality falls, as girls receive education, as women gain economic agency, birth rates fall with remarkable consistency and predictability. the population curve is not a straight line accelerating upward. It is an S-curve and is approaching its plateau, with the global population projected to stabilize at somewhere between 10 and 12 billion people before the end of this century, driven by demographic transitions already underway across the developing world. The strategic implications of this single corrective insight are enormous. Every business model, every resource allocation framework, every geopolitical strategy built on the assumption of indefinitely accelerating population growth is operating on a false premise. The market opportunities, resource constraints, and competitive dynamics of a world whose population stabilizes at 11 billion are categorically different from those of a world whose population continues growing without limit. And the professionals and organizations that updated their mental models to reflect the S-curve reality rather than the straight-line fiction have a structural strategic advantage that compounds over every planning cycle. But the straight-line instinct extends far beyond demographic projections. In financial markets, it manifests as the systematic tendency to extrapolate recent performance, whether of an asset class, a sector, or an individual security, forward in time, as if the conditions that produced that performance will persist indefinitely. The behavioral finance literature has documented this tendency with extraordinary rigor, demonstrating that it produces predictable, exploitable patterns of overvaluation during periods of strong performance and undervaluation during periods of weakness. The investor who understands that performance curves are rarely straight lines and who builds a framework for identifying the inflection points where the trajectory changes is not operating with better data than their counterparts. They are operating with a more accurate cognitive model for interpreting the same data. In competitive strategy, the straight-line instinct produces the catastrophic error of assuming that a competitor's current trajectory will continue uninterrupted. Companies that were growing rapidly will continue growing rapidly. Companies that were declining will continue declining. Technologies that were improving at a certain rate will continue improving at that rate. Each of these assumptions has produced legendary strategic failures. Incumbent companies that dismissed disruptive competitors because their initial trajectory appeared too modest to threaten, and disruptive challengers that overestimated their own momentum and failed to anticipate the inflection points where their growth curve would flatten. The antidote Rosling prescribes begins with the discipline of asking for every trend you are using as a strategic input, what shape is this curve actually taking? Not what shape does it appear to be taking over the most recent data points that are most salient in my memory, but what does the full historical trajectory reveal about the underlying dynamics, and what do those dynamics suggest about where the inflection points are likely to occur? This requires active resistance to the brain's preference for the simplest possible projection, which is always the straight line, in favor of a more metabolically expensive but more accurate engagement with the actual shape of the data. The second component of the antidote is the cultivation of what might be called curve literacy, a working familiarity with the most common nonlinear patterns that complex systems exhibit, so that when a trend is encountered, the analytical eye can. The default is not the straight line, but rather a genuine inquiry into which of the known curve families this trend most closely resembles: the S-curve of technology adoption, the bell curve of market saturation, the exponential growth of compounding growth, the logistic curve of resource-constrained expansion. Each of these has a different strategic implication, and each of them is invisible to the straight-line thinker who has already closed the question by extending the most recent trajectory forward without interrogation. The future is not a straight line projected from the present. It is a curve whose shape is determined by forces that your instincts are systematically designed to ignore. There is a profound and dangerous disconnect at the center of every risk assessment framework you have ever used, every contingency plan you have ever built, and every strategic decision you have ever made under conditions of uncertainty. It is not a flaw in your analytical methodology. It is not a gap in your information sources. It is a fundamental misalignment between the risks that your brain is designed to perceive as threatening and the risks that the empirical data identifies as actually likely to harm you. This misalignment is the fear instinct, and it is the most emotionally powerful, most cognitively disruptive, and most strategically expensive of the 10 instincts Rosling documented, precisely because it does not feel like a bias at all. It feels like clarity. It feels like appropriate vigilance. It feels like the responsible exercise of executive judgment in the face of genuine danger. The fear instinct is the brain's hardwired alarm system, and like all alarm systems, it was calibrated for a specific threat environment that no longer exists in the form that shaped its design. The human amygdala, the neural structure most directly associated with fear response, was refined over millions of years to respond with maximum speed and intensity to 3 categories of threat: physical danger, captivity, and contamination. These were the categories of threat that killed people in the ancestral environment, and the organism whose alarm system responded fastest and most intensely to these categories of threat survived more reliably than the organism whose response was slower or more measured. The result is a fear response system that is extraordinarily fast, extraordinarily powerful, and extraordinarily poorly calibrated for the actual risk landscape of a complex modern world. The operational consequence of this miscalibration is both measurable and precise. Rosling documented it through a systematic analysis of what people fear most versus what the actuarial data shows actually kills them. People fear plane crashes with an intensity that bears no relationship to the statistical probability of dying in one. They fear terrorism with an emotional weight that is orders of magnitude disproportionate to its actual contribution to mortality in the populations most focused on it. Fear dramatic, sudden, violent, visible threats, the categories that would have been existentially relevant in the ancestral environment, while dramatically underestimating the slow, gradual, statistically distributed risks that the data consistently identifies as the primary drivers of actual harm: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, road traffic accidents, preventable infections. These kill in numbers that dwarf every dramatic threat that dominates the fear landscape of the modern professional, but they do not trigger the amygdala response because they lack the evolutionary signature of immediate physical danger. For the executive and the strategist, the implications of this miscalibration extend beyond personal health decisions into the core of organizational risk management. Every crisis communication framework that prioritizes risks most likely to generate media coverage over the risks most likely to generate actual organizational damage is an institutionalized expression of the fear instinct operating at the corporate level. Every board-level risk register that weights reputational risks associated with dramatic, visible, emotionally resonant events more heavily than the slow-moving operational risks that the data identifies as more probable and more severe is a formal document of fear instinct distortion. Every investment committee that responds to market volatility, the dramatic, visible, emotionally resonant movement of prices with more urgency than it responds to the gradual structural deterioration of underlying fundamentals, is making fear instinct errors with capital. Rosling's framework for correcting the fear instinct begins with a discipline he called calculating the calm, a deliberate practice of separating the emotional intensity of a perceived threat from its actual probability and magnitude. The question is never, how frightening is this? The question is always, how likely is this? How severe would the actual impact be if it materialized? And how does that expected value compare to the expected value of the other risks competing for my attention and resources? This calculation is not complex in principle. It is extraordinarily difficult in practice because it requires overriding an alarm system that evolution has made very nearly impossible to ignore through conscious effort alone. The second component of the antidote is what Rosling described as risk comparison, the practice of never evaluating a risk in isolation, but always in explicit comparison to alternative risks of known probability and magnitude. This practice directly counters the mechanism by which the fear instinct distorts risk assessment, which is the isolation of a dramatic threat from its statistical context. A risk that appears enormous when presented in isolation often reveals itself as relatively minor when placed in explicit comparison with the full distribution of risks competing for the same attention and resources. And a risk that appears manageable in isolation often reveals itself as severely underweighted. Reveals that it is claiming a disproportionately small share of analytical attention relative to its actual expected impact. The third component operates at the level of organizational culture rather than individual cognition. The fear instinct is not merely a personal cognitive bias, it is a social and organizational amplifier. Fear spreads through social networks with a speed and fidelity that accurate information cannot match because the brain's threat detection system is specifically optimized to prioritize and transmit fear signals. This means that in any organization operating under conditions of genuine uncertainty, the fear instinct will systematically distort collective decision-making unless there are structural mechanisms in place to counteract it. The leader who understands this dynamic and builds deliberate practices of calm, data-driven risk assessment into their organizational culture is not merely managing their own cognitive biases, they are creating a structural advantage over every competitor whose organizational culture allows the fear instinct to operate unchecked. The risks that will actually damage you are almost never the ones keeping you awake at night, and the ones keeping you awake at night are consuming the cognitive resources you need to see the ones that will. There is a specific form of analytical blindness that affects intelligent, data-literate professionals with the same reliability and the same devastating consequences as it affects those with no quantitative training whatsoever. It does not discriminate by education level, by professional experience, or by the sophistication of the analytical frameworks being deployed. It operates at a level beneath all of those, at the level of raw perception, where numbers enter consciousness before analysis begins and are already distorted before any framework is applied to them. This is the size instinct, the systematic human inability to interpret numerical data accurately in the absence of appropriate comparative context, and it is embedded so deeply in the cognitive architecture of every professional who has ever used a data point to support a strategic argument that its correction requires not a new analytical tool, but a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between numbers and meaning. The size instinct operates through a mechanism that is both simple and extraordinarily difficult to override once you understand it. When the human brain encounters a number, it does not process that number as a point in a distribution, as a ratio relative to a baseline, or as a magnitude relative to a comparison class. It processes it as an absolute quantity and immediately assigns it an emotional weight based on its surface size relative to the brain's internal reference points that were calibrated in an ancestral environment where the largest numbers encountered were in the hundreds or thousands, not in the millions, billions, and trillions that characterize modern economic, demographic, and epidemiological data. The result is a systematic pattern of misinterpretation in which large absolute numbers generate inappropriately intense responses regardless of their relative significance, and small absolute numbers generate inappropriately muted responses regardless of their actual importance within their proper context. Rosling illustrated this with a data point that has become one of the most cited examples in the behavioral economics literature on numerical cognition. When audiences were told that 4 million children die every year in the world, the response was appropriate horror and a sense of overwhelming scale. When they were then told that in 1950 the same figure was 20 million, the emotional recalibration was dramatic, not because the current figure became acceptable, but because the comparative context transformed the meaning of the number entirely. 4 million deaths is a tragedy of enormous proportions by any reasonable standard. It is also a 75% reduction from a baseline that represented the normal condition of humanity within living memory. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the failure to hold both simultaneously, the failure that the size instinct produces, generates a completely distorted picture of where the world actually stands on this dimension. For the executive and the strategist, the size instinct manifests most destructively in the domain of financial and market data analysis. A revenue figure of $100 million sounds enormous in absolute terms and triggers the brain's large number response with all its associated emotional weight. Whether it represents extraordinary performance or catastrophic underachievement depends entirely on the context, the size of the addressable market, the performance of comparable entities, the historical trajectory of the metric, the capital deployed to generate it. Stripped of that context, it is not a data point at all. It is a number, and a number without context is not information. It is the raw material of cognitive distortion dressed in the clothing of analytical rigor. The practice of presenting numbers without comparative context is not always accidental. In the media ecosystem, in political communication, and in corporate reporting, the deliberate deployment of decontextualized numbers is a sophisticated influence technique that exploits the size instinct to produce predetermined emotional responses in audiences whose analytical defenses are not calibrated to detect this specific form of manipulation. A statistic presented as an absolute number, stripped of its baseline, its rate of change, its comparison class, and its distributional context, is not a fact. It is a rhetorical instrument, and the professional who cannot distinguish between these two things is not analyzing data. They are consuming pre-processed conclusions delivered in numerical format. Rosling prescribed two primary antidotes for the size instinct, both of which operate by forcing the brain to engage with comparative context before assigning meaning to a number. The first is what he called the ratio rule, the discipline of never accepting a number as meaningful until it has been expressed as a ratio relative to an appropriate baseline, deaths per 100,000 population rather than absolute death counts, revenue per unit of capital deployed rather than absolute revenue, market share percentage rather than absolute customer count, growth rate relative to baseline rather than absolute growth magnitude. Each of these transformations does the same cognitive work. It strips the number of its raw surface size and forces the brain to engage with its actual significance within a properly calibrated comparison framework. The second antidote is the discipline of comparison shopping for numbers, the practice of actively seeking out the comparison figures that place a number in its proper context, even when those comparison figures are not provided by the source presenting the original data point. This practice requires a specific form of analytical skepticism that treats every decontextualized number not as a datum to be accepted and incorporated into a mental model, but as a claim requiring verification through comparative analysis before it earns the right to influence a strategic judgment. The professional who builds this practice into their analytical workflow is not merely protecting themselves against the size instinct. They are developing a capability for detecting the deliberate deployment of decontextualized numbers as influence instruments, which is a competitive intelligence skill of considerable value in any high-stakes professional environment. Numbers without context are not data. They are the most sophisticated form of ignorance because they carry the appearance of precision while delivering the substance of distortion. Part 7. The Generalization Instinct: How Your Categories Are Destroying Your Judgment. There is a cognitive mechanism operating in every assessment you make of a market, a person, a culture, a competitor, or a demographic segment that is so fundamental to human information processing that dismantling it feels like dismantling the very apparatus of thought itself. It is not a peripheral bias that can be corrected with a checklist or a reminder. It is the foundational architecture by which the human brain organizes the overwhelming complexity of reality into manageable units of meaning, and it is simultaneously one of the most reliable sources of catastrophic analytical error in every domain where accurate judgment matters. This is the generalization instinct, the automatic, irresistible cognitive drive to take a characteristic observed in one member or subset of a category and apply it as a defining feature of the entire category, collapsing the full distribution of variation within that category into a single representative point that exists nowhere in the actual data. The generalization instinct is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of a cognitive system that was designed for efficiency rather than accuracy. The brain cannot process the full complexity of every individual entity it encounters. It requires categories, compressed representations that allow rapid classification and response without the metabolically expensive work of treating every new encounter as a completely novel analytical problem. In the ancestral environment, this compression was not merely efficient, it was survival critical. The organism that could rapidly classify a new plant as belonging to the category of edible plants based on observed similarities to known edible plants without conducting a full biochemical analysis had a genuine adaptive advantage. The organism that treated every plant as categorically unique and required complete novel analysis before acting would have starved. The catastrophic limitation of this system emerges when it is applied to categories whose internal variation is so large that the category mean is a poor predictor of any individual member's characteristics, which is to say, when it is applied to virtually every category that matters in modern strategic analysis. The category of emerging markets contains economies with structural dynamics, consumer behavior patterns, regulatory environments, and growth trajectories so different from one another that using the category as an analytical unit produces predictions that are systematically less accurate than treating each market individually. The category of millennials contains individuals whose values, spending behaviors, career orientations, and life stage decisions span a range so wide that marketing strategies built on the category mean fail at rates that should have discredited the category as a strategic tool decades ago. The category of risk-averse investors contains actors whose specific risk tolerances, time horizons, and portfolio objectives vary so dramatically that treating them as a homogeneous group produces investment product designs that satisfy almost none of them optimally. Rosling's empirical demonstration of the generalization instinct focused on the category of developing countries, a label so widely used in policy, business, and academic discourse that its internal contradictions have been effectively invisible to most of the professionals deploying it. When the actual data on health outcomes, education levels, income trajectories, urbanization rates, and institutional quality across the countries grouped under this label is examined, the variation within the category dwarfs the variation between the category and its supposed opposite. A professional using developing country as an analytical category is not working with a data compression that trades some accuracy for processing efficiency. They are working with a category whose internal variance is so high that it provides essentially zero predictive value for any of the dimensions that matter most for strategic decision-making, and they are paying the full cognitive cost of believing they have meaningful information when they have almost none. The mechanism by which the generalization instinct compounds its damage is the interaction between categorical thinking and confirmation bias. Once a category has been formed and a representative characteristic assigned to it, the brain's information processing system actively filters incoming data to preferentially register information that confirms the category and its assigned characteristics, while systematically de-emphasizing information that challenges them. This means that the initial error of overgeneralization does not remain static. It actively recruits supporting evidence and actively suppresses disconfirming evidence, producing a self-reinforcing distortion that becomes more entrenched with every additional data point the professional encounters, regardless of what that data actually shows. For the negotiator, the generalization instinct produces a specific and particularly expensive form of error, the misreading of a counterpart based on their categorical membership rather than their individual behavioral data. The negotiator who has categorized their counterpart as a member of a group associated with a particular negotiating style, risk tolerance, or decision-making framework will systematically misinterpret behavioral signals that deviate from the categorical expectation, either failing to register them entirely or reinterpreting them in ways that force them into conformity with the pre-existing category. This produces a negotiating dynamic in which one party is responding to a mental model of their counterpart, rather than to their counterpart, a form of strategic blindness that the counterpart who understands this dynamic can exploit with considerable precision. Rosling's antidote for the generalization instinct operates on two levels. The first is the discipline of always questioning the validity of a category before using it as an analytical unit, asking explicitly how much variation exists within this category, whether that variation is relevant to the specific judgment being made, and whether the category mean is actually a useful predictor of the specific case being analyzed. The second is the practice of actively seeking out the within-category variation that the generalization instinct is designed to suppress, deliberately looking for the members of a category who deviate most dramatically from the assumed representative characteristics, because those deviations contain the most strategically valuable information about where the category is breaking down as an analytical tool. The category is a tool for processing complexity. When it becomes a substitute for engaging with complexity, it stops being an analytical asset and becomes an analytical liability of the most dangerous kind, one that feels exactly like knowledge while systematically producing ignorance. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in the way educated professionals think about cultures, nations, religions, and human systems that it rarely surfaces as an assumption. Explicit belief, it operates instead as an invisible axiom, a foundational premise so taken for granted that it shapes every conclusion built upon it without ever being subjected to the scrutiny it would immediately fail if examined directly. It is the assumption that certain things do not change, that certain cultures are defined by characteristics that are permanent features of their nature, rather than temporary expressions of their current circumstances, that certain nations are destined by history, religion, or geography to occupy specific positions in the global order indefinitely, that certain populations are characterized by values and behaviors that represent fixed properties of their identity, rather than adaptive responses to conditions that are themselves changing. This is the destiny instinct, and it is responsible for more missed strategic opportunities, more catastrophically misdirected investments, and more comprehensively wrong long-range forecasts than any other single cognitive distortion in the professional analytical toolkit. The destiny instinct emerges from the interaction between two features of human cognition that are individually useful and jointly catastrophic: The first is the brain's strong preference for stable, predictable models of the world, models that do not require constant updating, that provide reliable guidance for repeated decisions, and that reduce the metabolic cost of navigating a complex environment. The second is the brain's tendency to conflate current observation with permanent characteristic, to interpret what something is doing right now as evidence of what it is by nature, rather than as evidence of what it is doing under current conditions that may themselves be changing. Together, these two features produce a cognitive system that builds stable models of the world based on current observations and then defends those models against updating, even as the underlying reality they were built to represent undergoes fundamental transformation. Rosling's empirical challenge to the destiny instinct focused on one of its most consequential expressions, the widespread professional conviction that the values and behaviors associated with high fertility rates in certain populations are permanent cultural characteristics, rather than rational, adaptive responses to specific economic and social conditions. The data on this point is unambiguous and has been so for decades. As child mortality falls, as parents gain confidence that the children they have will survive to adulthood, fertility rates fall with remarkable consistency and speed across every cultural, religious, and geographic context studied. The values that appear to be permanent cultural characteristics favoring large families are not permanent at all. They are rational responses to a specific set of conditions, and when those conditions change, the values change with them, consistently, predictably, and at speeds that the destiny instinct makes completely invisible to anyone relying on a fixed nature model of the culture in question. The strategic implications of this single corrective insight are transformative for anyone making long-range assessments of market development, demographic trends, or geopolitical trajectories. Every market entry strategy built on the assumption that current consumer behavior patterns in a target market represent permanent cultural characteristics is operating on a premise that the data has repeatedly and decisively refuted. The consumer behaviors, value orientations, and purchasing patterns of a population at income level 2 are not permanent cultural features of that population. They are rational, adaptive responses to operating at income level 2, and they will change systematically and predictably as that population moves toward income level 3. The professional who builds their market model on fixed nature assumptions will be consistently wrong about the direction, speed, and magnitude of those changes, not occasionally, not randomly, but systematically and in a specific, predictable direction. In the context of geopolitical and competitive strategy, the destiny instinct produces a specific form of analytical error that Rosling identified as particularly expensive, the misreading of current weakness as permanent incapacity. Nations, organizations, and competitors that are currently performing poorly on key dimensions are not necessarily demonstrating fixed characteristics of their nature. They may be demonstrating the predictable outputs of conditions that are themselves changing, conditions whose change will produce performance transformations that the destiny instinct makes invisible to the analyst who has already assigned them to the category of permanently limited. The strategic history of the last half-century is filled with examples of nations, industries, and organizations that were confidently assigned to the category of permanently limited by analysts operating under the destiny instinct, and that subsequently underwent transformations of such magnitude and speed that those analysts' frameworks were not merely wrong, they were inverted. The antidote Rosling prescribes for the destiny instinct begins with a discipline that is conceptually simple and practically demanding, the habit of always asking for any characteristic currently attributed to a person, culture, nation, or organization, whether that characteristic is actually a fixed property of their nature or a current output of conditions that are themselves subject to change. This question does not always produce a clear answer, but asking it consistently disrupts the automatic categorical assignment that the destiny instinct performs without interrogation and creates the cognitive space for a more accurate engagement with the actual dynamics driving observed behavior. The second component of the antidote is the cultivation of what might be called change literacy, a working familiarity with the historical record of cultural, institutional, and behavioral transformation, sufficient to calibrate the brain's default assumption away from fixity and toward the recognition that profound change is not the exception in human systems, but the norm. Every value system, every cultural practice, every institutional structure, and every behavioral pattern that currently appears permanent has a history of transformation, and that history is the most reliable available evidence about its future trajectory. The professional who reads that history systematically is not an optimist or a pessimist about human potential for change. They are an empiricist, working with the actual data rather than with the intuitive but factually unsupported assumption that what is currently true will remain true indefinitely. Slow change is still change, and the professional who cannot see it will always be surprised by it, never in a position to have anticipated it, never in a position to have built strategy around it, always arriving after the transformation has already occurred and the opportunity has already been claimed by someone whose cognitive model was more accurately calibrated to the actual dynamics of a world that does not stand still. There is a paradox at the heart of professional expertise that is so counterintuitive, so resistant to the ego structures that expertise inevitably constructs, and so thoroughly documented in the empirical literature on judgment and decision-making that its consistent denial by the very professionals it most affects must itself be counted as one of the most reliable phenomena in the psychology of high-stakes cognition. The paradox is this: the deeper and more refined your expertise in a specific analytical domain, the more likely you are to apply that domain's frameworks to problems that lie outside its valid range of application, and the more confident you will be in the resulting conclusions, and the more catastrophically wrong those conclusions will be. This is the single perspective instinct, the cognitive gravitational pull of a single analytical lens that has proven powerful enough within its domain to generate the illusion that it is powerful enough outside it, and the professional and organizational damage it produces is precisely proportional to the sophistication and success of the expertise that feeds it. The single perspective instinct does not emerge from intellectual laziness, it emerges from intellectual success. When a particular analytical framework, whether it is economic modeling, engineering systems thinking, medical diagnostic reasoning, legal analysis, or any of the dozens of domain-specific cognitive toolkits that professional training produces, has consistently generated accurate predictions and successful outcomes within its valid range of application, the brain builds a powerful associative network linking that framework to the experience of analytical competence and the reward of correct judgment. This associative network does not come equipped with explicit boundary markers indicating where the framework's valid range of application ends. It comes equipped only with the accumulated reinforcement of successful application, which the brain generalizes through the same generalization instinct examined in the previous section into a broad and largely unexamined confidence in the framework's universal applicability. Rosling observed this dynamic with particular clarity in the domain of global health and development policy, where the single perspective instinct produced two distinct but equally damaging failure modes. The first was the failure mode of the pure data analyst, the professional whose mastery of statistical methodology produced such confidence in quantitative frameworks that qualitative dimensions of human behavior, cultural context, and institutional dynamics were systematically underweighted or entirely ignored in their assessments. The second was the failure mode of the field practitioner, the professional whose deep experience with specific communities and contexts produced such confidence in qualitative judgment that statistical data challenging their experiential conclusions was dismissed as missing the human reality that only direct engagement could reveal. Both of these professionals were applying genuine expertise, and both were producing systematically distorted assessments because their expertise had become a lens through which all evidence was filtered, rather than one tool among many deployed selectively based on the specific demands of each analytical problem. For the executive operating in complex, rapidly evolving competitive environments, the single perspective instinct manifests most destructively in the domain of strategic diagnosis, the process of identifying the root causes of organizational performance problems and selecting the interventions most likely to address them effectively. The executive whose professional formation was in finance will diagnose most strategic problems as fundamentally financial in nature and prescribe financial solutions. The executive whose formation was in operations will diagnose most problems as process failures and prescribe operational solutions. The executive whose formation was in marketing will locate the root cause in customer insight failures and prescribe market research solutions. Each of these diagnoses may contain genuine insight. Each of them also systematically excludes the dimensions of the problem that fall outside the executive's primary analytical lens. And in complex organizational systems, those excluded dimensions are frequently the ones where the actual leverage for change is located. The damage compounds when the single perspective instinct interacts with organizational hierarchy. The more senior the executive whose analytical lens dominates a strategic process, the more completely that lens will shape the information that is brought forward for consideration, the questions that are treated as relevant, the solutions that are regarded as viable, and the metrics that are used to evaluate outcomes. An organization whose strategic leadership is dominated by a single analytical perspective does not merely make decisions through that lens, it builds information systems, talent development pipelines, and organizational cultures that systematically produce and amplify perspectives consistent with that lens, while marginalizing perspectives that challenge it. The result is an organization that becomes progressively less capable of seeing the dimensions of its competitive environment that its dominant analytical framework renders invisible. Rosling's antidote for the single perspective instinct is built on a principle he articulated with characteristic directness: having a toolbox rather than a hammer. The professional who has internalized this principle does not approach each new analytical problem by deploying their most powerful and familiar framework and then interpreting the problem through its output. They approach each problem by first asking which tools are actually most appropriate for this specific problem, given its specific structural features, its specific information environment, and the specific decisions that its analysis is intended to support. This requires a working familiarity with multiple analytical frameworks across multiple domains. Not the deep expertise of a specialist in each, but sufficient competence to recognize when a problem's structure calls for a framework outside one's primary domain, and sufficient intellectual humility to seek that framework's application rather than forcing the problem into the shape that the familiar tool can address. The second component of the antidote is the deliberate construction of analytical diversity in the teams and advisory relationships through which complex strategic problems are examined. The individual professional can only hold so many frameworks in active working memory simultaneously, but an analytically diverse team, structured to bring genuinely different cognitive tools to bear on shared problems, can collectively access a range of perspectives that no individual member possesses. The critical design requirement is that the diversity be genuine, that the different perspectives actually challenge rather than reinforce each other, and that the organizational culture create conditions where that challenge is productive rather than threatening. The most dangerous expert in any room is the one who stopped being curious about the tools they do not yet possess. There is a cognitive reflex so instantaneous, so emotionally satisfying, and so thoroughly destructive to accurate causal understanding that it has single-handedly derailed more post-crisis analyses, more organizational learning processes, and more strategic interventions than any other single feature of human judgment. It activates within milliseconds of encountering a negative outcome of any significance. It produces an immediate sense of explanatory closure that feels indistinguishable from genuine understanding. It directs all subsequent analytical energy toward confirming its initial conclusion rather than interrogating it. And it consistently produces the same outcome: a named villain, a delivered verdict, and a complete failure to understand the actual systemic dynamics that produced the outcome being explained. This is the blame instinct, and its dominance in professional, organizational, and public discourse is not a sign of moral seriousness or accountability culture. It is a sign of analytical immaturity masquerading as ethical rigor. The blame instinct is rooted in the same evolutionary architecture that produced the other 9 instincts, a cognitive system designed for a social environment in which the most important causal questions were personal rather than systemic. In a small social group operating in a physically immediate threat environment, the most strategically relevant causal question after a negative outcome was almost always "who did this?" because in that environment, negative outcomes were almost always produced by the intentional or negligent actions of specific, identifiable agents whose future behavior could be influenced through social sanction, exclusion, or correction. The cognitive system that rapidly identified the responsible agent and mobilized the social mechanisms of accountability was performing a genuinely adaptive function. The problem is that the complex systems within which modern negative outcomes are produced, financial markets, healthcare systems, supply chains, organizational structures, geopolitical dynamics, are not small social groups. They are multi-layered, non-linear, feedback-driven systems in which outcomes are produced by the interaction of dozens or hundreds of contributing factors, none of which is individually sufficient to produce the outcome, and most of which are structural rather than personal in character. Rosling illustrated the destructive operation of the blame instinct through its application to global health crises, contexts in which the compulsive search for a villain not only fails to identify the actual causal drivers of the crisis, but actively prevents the systemic analysis that would. When a disease outbreak produces mass casualties in a specific region, the blame instinct immediately generates candidates: corrupt local officials, negligent international organizations, pharmaceutical companies that withheld treatments, governments that failed to act. Each of these candidates may have genuinely contributed to the outcome. None of them is the cause, in the sense that the blame instinct requires a single identifiable agent whose removal or punishment would prevent recurrence. The actual causal structure is a system, a configuration of incentives, resource allocations, institutional capacities, information flows, and decision architectures that produced the outcome through their interaction, and that will produce similar outcomes again unless the system itself is redesigned, regardless of how many individuals are held accountable for their roles within it. For the executive and the strategist, the blame instinct has operational consequences that are both immediate and structural. At the immediate level, every postmortem analysis conducted primarily through the lens of the blame instinct produces an organizational learning failure. The named villain, whether an individual, a team, a competitor, or an external factor, absorbs the analytical energy that should be directed at systemic diagnosis, and the organization emerges from the process with a verdict rather than an understanding. The The systemic factors that actually drove the failure remain unexamined, unaddressed, and fully operational for the production of the next failure, which will arrive on schedule and generate its own villain, its own verdict, and its own learning failure in an organizational cycle that can persist for decades without ever producing genuine improvement in the underlying system. At the structural level, the blame instinct shapes organizational culture in ways that are far more damaging than any individual postmortem failure. Organizations whose accountability culture is primarily blame-oriented, where the primary consequence of failure is the identification and punishment of responsible individuals, systematically suppress the information flows that accurate causal analysis requires. Individuals operating in blame-oriented cultures learn rapidly that the accurate reporting of failure, uncertainty, and systemic dysfunction is personally dangerous, and they respond rationally by filtering the information they surface upward through organizational hierarchies to minimize their personal exposure to blame. The result is an organization whose leadership operates on systematically distorted information, making decisions about a sanitized version of organizational reality that bears decreasing resemblance to the actual dynamics operating at the levels where work is performed and value is created or destroyed. Rosling's antidote for the blame instinct requires a fundamental reorientation of the analytical question asked in the aftermath of any significant negative outcome. The question is not who is responsible, though individual accountability may remain relevant and appropriate as a separate question. The primary analytical question is what system produced this outcome, and what features of that system made this outcome likely or inevitable, regardless of the specific individuals occupying the roles within it. This reorientation is not an evasion of accountability. It is the prerequisite for the kind of causal understanding that makes genuine accountability meaningful, because holding individuals accountable for outcomes produced primarily by systemic factors that they could not have individually controlled is not accountability. It is the theatrical performance of accountability, and it is indistinguishable from the real thing in its emotional and social dynamics, while being its complete opposite in its analytical and organizational consequences. The second component of the antidote is the discipline of explicitly mapping the system before assigning individual responsibility. Identifying the structural factors, incentive configurations, information architectures, and resource constraints that shaped the decision environment within which the identified individuals operated, and assessing honestly how much of the observed behavior was individually chosen versus structurally produced. This mapping does not exonerate individuals whose decisions genuinely deviated from what the system would have predicted. It does ensure that the organizational energy devoted to individual accountability is proportional to the individual contribution to the outcome, and that the remaining energy, which in most complex organizational failures is the larger share, is directed at the systemic redesign that is the only intervention with genuine leverage over future outcomes. Finding the villain feels like justice. Understanding the system is justice. There is a state of cognitive emergency that the human brain can be triggered into by a specific combination of perceived threat, time pressure, and high-stakes framing, a state in which the full architecture of analytical capability that distinguishes sophisticated professional judgment from impulsive reaction is systematically shut down and replaced by a stripped-down, speed-optimized decision protocol that was designed for physical emergencies and is catastrophically inappropriate for the complex, data-rich, strategically nuanced environments where modern high-stakes decisions are actually made. This state is not weakness. It is not panic in the colloquial sense. It can occur in the most composed, the most experienced, and the most analytically sophisticated professionals in any field, triggered not by genuine physical emergency, but by the linguistic and framing architecture of a situation constructed, whether deliberately or accidentally, to activate the brain's urgency response. This is the urgency instinct, the final and in many ways the most operationally dangerous of the 10 cognitive distortions Rosling documented, because it does not merely distort the conclusions of analysis, it terminates analysis itself and substitutes the illusion of decisive action for the reality of informed judgment. The urgency instinct operates through a neural mechanism that is among the most thoroughly studied in the behavioral neuroscience literature. When the brain perceives a combination of threat and time pressure that crosses a specific threshold, a threshold whose calibration was set in an evolutionary environment where the relevant threats were physical and the relevant time pressures were measured in seconds, it triggers a cascade of neurochemical changes that progressively narrow the focus of attention, accelerate the pace of information processing, reduce the threshold for action initiation, and suppress the prefrontal cortical activity. With deliberative analytical reasoning, this cascade was extraordinarily adaptive in the environment that shaped it. The organism that could transition rapidly from deliberative reasoning to rapid action in response to a genuine physical emergency survived encounters that killed the organism whose deliberative processes continued operating at full bandwidth when immediate physical response was required. The problem is that the neurochemical trigger for this cascade does not distinguish between a genuine physical emergency and a strategically constructed narrative of urgency, between a predator in the grass and a negotiating counterpart who says, "This offer expires in 1 hour." Rosling's documentation of the urgency instinct focused on its expression in the domain of global policy, the consistent pattern by which complex, long-term systemic challenges are reframed as acute crises requiring immediate, decisive action, and the consistent pattern of policy failures that this reframing produces. When a complex challenge is successfully framed as an emergency, the political and institutional mechanisms that exist specifically to introduce deliberation, evidence review, stakeholder consultation, and iterative refinement into policy development are bypassed in favor of rapid, decisive action. The action that results is not merely uninformed by the analytical process it bypassed, it is actively shaped by the distortions that the urgency instinct introduces into the decision-making architecture. It overweights dramatic, visible, immediately actionable interventions over slow, structural, systemic ones. It underweights second and third order consequences that a more deliberative process would have surfaced. It anchors on the first viable solution identified, rather than conducting the comparative analysis that might reveal superior alternatives, and it forecloses the iterative refinement that complex systemic challenges require by committing resources and political capital to a specific intervention before the feedback loops that would reveal its inadequacies have had time to operate. For the executive, the negotiator, and the strategist, the urgency instinct is weaponized against them in every high-stakes interaction by counterparts who understand, whether intuitively or explicitly, that a decision made under artificially induced time pressure is a decision made with degraded analytical capability. The artificial deadline is not merely a negotiating tactic, it is a cognitive attack on the prefrontal cortical function of the person against whom it is deployed, a mechanism for triggering the neurochemical cascade that narrows analytical bandwidth precisely at the moment when the broadest possible analytical engagement with the decision would produce the best outcome. The professional who recognizes this mechanism and has developed practices for resisting it is not merely a more disciplined negotiator, they are operating with a structural cognitive advantage over every counterpart who has not made this recognition. Advantage that compounds across every high-stakes interaction where artificial urgency is deployed as an influence instrument. The antidote Rosling prescribes for the urgency instinct begins with a discipline that is conceptually simple and practically demanding in equal measure. The habit of treating the feeling of urgency itself as a data point requiring analysis, rather than as an accurate perception of actual time constraints requiring immediate response. When the urgency response activates, the first analytical question is not, what should I do right now? It is this urgency real or constructed? And if it is real, is the time pressure actually as tight as the urgency response is representing it to be? This question does not always produce a comfortable answer, but asking it consistently creates the cognitive space needed to engage the deliberative analytical capabilities that the urgency instinct is designed to suppress. The second component of the antidote is the pre-commitment to specific deliberative practices that are activated automatically in high-stakes situations where urgency pressure is present. Practices that do not depend on in-the-moment recognition of the urgency instinct's operation, because in the moment of its operation, the cognitive resources required for that recognition are precisely what the instinct is suppressing. These pre-commitments might include mandatory consultation periods before major decisions, explicit devil's advocate processes that must be completed before action is authorized, or structural requirements for evidence review that cannot be waived regardless of the urgency framing of the situation. The value of these structural commitments is not merely the deliberative quality they introduce into specific decisions, it is the signal they send to every counterpart and stakeholder that the urgency frame will not produce the analytical shutdown it is designed to produce. The most consequential decisions you will ever make will always feel like they need to be made right now. That feeling is the most reliable available evidence that you need more time. You have now been taken through the complete diagnostic map of human cognitive distortion. 10 instincts, each operating below the threshold of conscious awareness, each producing systematic and predictable errors in the way you perceive the world, assess risk, assign cause, and construct the mental models upon which every significant decision in your professional and personal life depends. The gap instinct that collapses the full spectrum of reality into two opposing camps. The negativity instinct that guarantees you will always believe things are deteriorating, regardless of what the data shows. The straight line instinct that blinds you to every inflection point in every trend you use as a strategic input. The fear instinct that misaligns your attention and resources toward dramatic but improbable threats, away from mundane but highly probable ones. The size instinct that strips numbers of their context and replaces meaning with magnitude. The generalization instinct that substitutes category means for individual realities. The destiny instinct that freezes dynamic systems into permanent characteristics. The single perspective instinct that reduces the full complexity of every problem to the dimensions visible through a single analytical lens. The blame instinct that finds villains where systems operate. And the urgency instinct that terminates analysis precisely when analysis is most urgently required. Each of these has been examined in isolation, dissected, documented, and connected to its specific operational consequences in the professional environments where you are required to perform. Now they must be examined together because the full destructive power of these instincts emerges not from their individual operation, but from their systematic interaction, the way each one reinforces and amplifies the others to produce a cognitive architecture that is, in its uncorrected state, almost perfectly designed to generate confident, coherent, internally consistent, and factually wrong pictures of reality. Factfulness thinking is not the absence of instinct. It is not the achievement of a purely rational cognitive state from which all evolutionary bias has been purged through sufficient intellectual effort. Rosling was explicit and emphatic on this point, and the explicitness was not rhetorical modesty. It was a precise empirical claim about the limits of what cognitive correction can actually achieve. The instincts are not bugs in the system that can be patched through awareness and willpower. They are features of the architecture that cannot be removed without removing the system itself. What factfulness thinking achieves is not the elimination of these instincts, but the construction of a parallel analytical layer that monitors their operation, identifies when they are distorting perception, and applies specific corrective practices calibrated to the specific distortion each instinct produces. This is not a small achievement. It is, in practical terms, the difference between a professional whose judgments are systematically shaped by cognitive forces they cannot see, and a professional whose judgments engage those same forces with sufficient awareness to prevent them from operating as the unchallenged final authority on what is real. The integrated architecture of factfulness inking rests on 4 foundational pillars that cut across all 10 instincts and provide the structural framework within which the instinct-specific corrections operate. The first pillar is proportionality, the discipline of always ensuring that the emotional and analytical weight assigned to any piece of information is proportional to its actual evidential significance rather than to its surface dramatic properties. This pillar directly addresses the negativity instinct, the fear instinct, and the size instinct simultaneously, because all 3 produce the same fundamental error, a misalignment between the intensity of the cognitive response and the actual significance of the information triggering it. Professionals who have internalized proportionality as a cognitive discipline does not merely correct individual instances of these instincts, they restructured the fundamental relationship between information reception and response intensity in a way that makes all 3 instincts significantly less able to distort their analytical outputs. The second pillar is contextualization, the discipline of never accepting any data point, trend, claim, or narrative as meaningful until it has been placed in its appropriate comparative and historical context. This pillar addresses the size instinct, the straight line instinct, and the destiny instinct, each of which produces its characteristic distortion by stripping information of its context that would reveal its actual significance. The number without its baseline, the trend without its inflection point history, the current characteristic without its changed trajectory. Contextualization as a practiced discipline does not merely correct these individual errors, it produces a fundamentally different relationship with information, in which the default cognitive response to any new data point is not acceptance and incorporation, but interrogation and contextual placement before any analytical weight is assigned. The third pillar is systemic thinking, the discipline of always asking, for any observed outcome or pattern, what system produced this, rather than who produced this, and what features of that system make this outcome likely to recur, rather than what individual actions explain this specific instance. Systemic thinking does not replace individual agency in the causal models it produces. It places individual agency within its proper structural context, assessing its contribution accurately, rather than either exaggerating it through the blame instinct or obscuring it through excessive structural determinism. The fourth pillar is calibrated humility, the practiced recognition that the accuracy of any mental model is always provisional, always subject to revision by new evidence, and always limited by the known and unknown biases of the cognitive system that constructed it. The professional who believes their mental model of the world is accurate will not apply the corrections that factfulness thinking requires, because they will not perceive the distortions those corrections are designed to address. Calibrated humility is not self-doubt. It is the accurate recognition that all human perception is mediated by a cognitive architecture with known systematic limitations, and that accounting for those limitations is not a sign of intellectual weakness, but the foundational requirement of intellectual integrity. These four pillars, applied consistently and simultaneously across the full range of analytical situations that professional life presents, do not produce perfect judgment. They produce systematically better judgment, judgment that is more accurate, more robust to manipulation, more capable of updating in response to new evidence, and more reliably calibrated to the actual complexity of the world rather than to the simplified, dramatized, instinct-processed version that uncorrected cognition delivers. The distance between understanding a cognitive framework and operationalizing it within the actual decision-making architecture of a high-stakes professional environment is not a small gap that enthusiasm and intellectual conviction can bridge. It is a structural challenge that requires the same deliberate engineering that any complex organizational capability requires: specific practices, embedded protocols, environmental design, and feedback mechanisms that make the desired cognitive behaviors the path of least resistance, rather than the product of constant, effortful override of deeply embedded instinctual patterns. Understanding factfulness is the prerequisite. Operationalizing it is the work, and the professionals and organizations that have done this work consistently demonstrate a pattern of strategic performance that is not merely incrementally better than their instinct-driven counterparts. It is categorically different in the quality, consistency, and resilience of the judgments it produces across the full range of conditions that high-stakes professional environments present. The first operational domain where factfulness thinking produces immediate and measurable impact is the strategic intelligence function, the processes by which organizations gather, filter, interpret, and act on information about their competitive environment, their market dynamics, and the macro-level trends that shape the context within which their strategies operate. Every strategic intelligence function that has not been explicitly designed to counteract the 10 instincts is by default an amplification system for them. The information gathering protocols will be biased toward dramatic, negative, immediately actionable intelligence, feeding the negativity and fear instincts. The interpretation frameworks will apply familiar analytical lenses uniformly across structurally different problems, feeding the single perspective and generalization instincts. The reporting structures will present decontextualized data points that trigger the size instinct, and the decision timelines will be compressed by urgency framing that triggers the urgency instinct precisely when the most consequential strategic assessments are being made. Redesigning the strategic intelligence function through the lens of factfulness begins with the explicit introduction of comparative baselines into every significant data point before it enters the decision-making process. This is not a complex intervention. It requires only the institutional commitment to treat any metric, any market figure, any performance indicator, or any trend data as incomplete until its baseline, its rate of change, and its comparison class have been identified and presented alongside the raw figure. The organizational discipline required to implement this consistently is significant because it runs directly against the cognitive preferences of every individual in the information chain. Preferences for simplicity, speed, and dramatic impact that decontextualized numbers satisfy more effectively than contextualized ones. But the strategic value of this discipline, measured in the quality of the decisions it enables, is immediate and compounding. The second operational domain is negotiation and counterpart assessment, the processes by which professionals read, interpret, and respond to the behavior, positions, and dynamics of the individuals and organizations they negotiate with, partner with, compete against, and manage. The 10 instincts produce a specific and consistent pattern of errors in this domain. The gap instinct generates binary assessments of counterpart positions, strong or weak, cooperative or adversarial, rational or emotional, that miss the actual complexity of any sophisticated actor's behavioral landscape. The generalization instinct produces category-based assessments that substitute stereotypical expectations for accurate reading of individual behavioral signals. The blame instinct generates villain narratives about difficult counterparts that prevent the systemic analysis of the structural factors driving their behavior. And the urgency instinct degrades analytical capacity precisely at the moments of highest negotiating pressure, when the most accurate reading of counterpart dynamics is most consequential. Operationalizing factfulness in the negotiation domain requires the pre-negotiation discipline of explicitly mapping the assumptions being brought into the interaction and subjecting each of them to the instinct audit, identifying which of the 10 instincts may have contributed to the formation of each assumption, and what the assumption would look like if that instinct's distortion were corrected. This pre-negotiation audit does not guarantee accurate counterpart assessment. It does systematically reduce the distortion introduced by instinct-driven assumption formation, and it creates a cognitive baseline of acknowledged uncertainty that makes the negotiator more responsive to disconfirming behavioral signals during the actual interaction, signals that the unaudited instinct architecture would filter out to preserve the coherence of its preformed model. The third operational domain is organizational culture and leadership communication, the processes by which senior leaders shape the information environment, the decision norms, and the cognitive culture of the organizations they lead. This domain is where the leverage of factfulness thinking is highest and where the resistance to its implementation is most entrenched, because organizational cultures are themselves expressions of the collective cognitive architecture of their leadership, and that architecture includes the full complement of the 10 instincts operating at the institutional level, with all the amplification that organizational hierarchy and social conformity provide. The leader who has done the work of factfulness calibration at the individual level and then communicates, decides, and models judgment in ways that continue to express uncorrected instinct patterns at the organizational level has achieved personal cognitive improvement at the cost of organizational cognitive stagnation. Leadership communication that operationalizes factfulness requires the deliberate practice of presenting information to organizations in contextualized, proportional, systemically framed ways that model the cognitive disciplines the leader wants the organization to internalize. This means presenting bad news with its baseline and its trajectory, alongside its current magnitude, modeling the resistance to the negativity instinct. It means presenting risk assessments with explicit probability weightings and comparison classes, modeling the resistance to the fear and size instincts. It means presenting causal analyses that identify systemic factors before individual ones, modeling the resistance to the blame instinct. And it means creating decision processes with structural deliberation requirements that cannot be collapsed by urgency framing, modeling the resistance to the urgency instinct at the organizational level where its effects are most consequential. The professional who operationalizes factfulness does not merely make better individual decisions. They build organizations, teams, and analytical cultures that are structurally more capable of accurate perception. And in a competitive environment where the accuracy of your picture of reality is the foundational determinant of strategic performance, that structural capability is the most durable and most compounding competitive advantage available. There is a final reckoning that every serious engagement with factfulness must eventually confront, a reckoning with what it actually means to see the world as it is, rather than as your instincts insist it must be, and with what that seeing demands of you, not merely as a professional operating in high-stakes environments, but as an individuals whose perception of reality shapes every judgment, every relationship, every allocation of attention and energy that constitutes the actual substance of a life lived with genuine clarity rather than confident illusion. Rosling spent the final years of his life. He died in 2017, leaving Factfulness as his final intellectual legacy, completing it from his deathbed with the knowledge that he would not survive to see its publication, making a specific and urgent argument that the stakes of this reckoning extend far beyond individual cognitive optimization. His argument was that the systematic misperception of the world that the 10 instincts produce is not merely a source of personal strategic error, it is a civilizational liability, a collective cognitive failure that produces misallocated resources, misdirected policy, paralyzed institutions, and a pervasive cultural pessimism that undermines the capacity for the kind of sustained, coordinated, evidence-driven action that the genuine challenges facing humanity actually require. When educated, well-resourced, well-intentioned professionals consistently believe the world is worse than it is, they direct their energy, their capital, and their institutional authority toward the dramatic, fear-driven, urgency-framed responses that their instincts demand, and away from the slow, systemic, evidence-guided interventions that the data consistently identifies as most effective. The world that Factfulness reveals is not a comfortable world. It is not a world without genuine problems, without real suffering, without urgent challenges that demand serious, sustained, well-resourced responses. Rosling was not an optimist in the sense of believing that everything was fine or that positive trends would continue automatically without effort. He was what he called a possibilist, someone whose assessment of what is possible is grounded in accurate perception of what is actually happening, rather than in the distorted picture that uncorrected instinct produces. And what accurate perception reveals is a world in which genuine progress has been achieved at scales and speeds that the negativity instinct makes invisible, through the application of exactly the kind of evidence-driven, systematically implemented, patiently executed interventions that the urgency and fear instincts consistently work to prevent. This is not a reason for complacency. It is the most powerful available argument for the approach that has actually worked, and the most devastating available critique of the dramatic, instinct-driven responses that feel most appropriate and consistently produce the worst outcomes. For you, the professional who has engaged with this complete framework, who has followed the surgical dismantling of each instinct through its operational consequences and its specific antidotes, the responsibility that Factfulness confers is precise and demanding. It is not the responsibility of knowing more than others, though accurate perception does produce genuine informational advantages in every competitive environment. It is the responsibility of deciding what to do with a more accurate picture of reality than the one most of the people you work with, compete against, and lead are operating on. That responsibility has both a professional and a human dimension, and neither can be reduced to the other without losing something essential. The professional dimension is the one this framework has addressed most directly. The obligation to build the analytical practices, the organizational structures, and the decision architectures that operationalize factfulness thinking in the environments where you have influence and authority. This is not altruism. It is the rational response to the recognition that your competitive performance is ultimately determined by the accuracy of your picture of reality, and that every investment in improving that accuracy compounds across every decision you make for the remainder of your professional life. The executive who builds a factfulness-calibrated organization does not merely make better decisions. They build an institution whose collective cognitive architecture is structurally more capable of accurate perception than its competitors, and that structural advantage is self-reinforcing in ways that conventional competitive advantages are not. The human dimension is less easily reduced to strategic calculation, and Rosling would have insisted that reducing it entirely to strategic calculation would itself be a form of the single perspective instinct, the reduction of a multidimensional reality to the dimensions visible through a single analytical lens. The human dimension is the recognition that accurate perception of the world carries with it a form of moral obligation, not the obligation of guilt or of savior complexity, but the simpler and more demanding obligation of intellectual honesty. To see the world as it actually is, with all the complexity and contradiction and genuine progress and genuine suffering that accurate perception reveals, and to communicate that perception honestly in the face of the social, professional, and emotional pressures that consistently reward the instinct-driven narratives of drama, crisis, and permanent deterioration. This is the practice that Rosling modeled throughout his career and that Factfulness documents as his complete intellectual legacy. The world is not perfect. It is not without genuine threats that demand serious responses, but it is measurably, demonstrably, and in many dimensions dramatically better than the picture your instincts are constructing and defending with the full force of 200,000 years of evolutionary refinement. Seeing that clearly, holding the complexity of a world that is simultaneously better than you think and still profoundly imperfect, still containing suffering that demands response and progress that demands acknowledgement, is not easy. It requires the sustained application of every discipline this framework has described. But it is the only foundation on which decisions worthy of the complexity of the actual world can be built.